All right, we're in AP Lit. We're going to watch this slide show. I'm proud of my subtitle here, so I'm going to show you the opening slide. At least when I was in school and younger, it was always idea that people are going to grow up and write the great American novel. That was the term used. And I think we were almost misled because it's already been written, and it's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. That is the way a lot of people see this book, that it is the great American novel. You line them up, this is at the top. Now, of course, it's a subjective thing. There's no way to determine the best of anything unless you're playing the game and you score more points. But a lot of people, that's what I meant by the status. This is the status of this book. And so, you just need to know that many people think it's the best or one of the best. I can't think of, Moby Dick also is in that category, and nobody ever reads Moby Dick. Have you ever read, I think we had this conversation, hey, I'm sorry.
How you doing?
Get caught up in.
In teaching, how dare you?
I know. All right, when we write it down.
No, you just tell me.
Lydia is not here, and Nathan is not here. I think everybody else is here.
Nathan Stevens?
Yes, sorry.
I thought I saw him come in this morning. Is he not in here?
He's
Okay.
not here.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, and Lydia Thompson.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so you just need to know that if there's a small group of books, those are the two that often come up. They were written in the same century. They may have known each other, I don't know about that. But so that's its status. How do you explain the novel's popularity and success? Well, that's a subjective answer too. But I think you ought to be able to see that when you're done, when you finish reading it. What's the big deal here? It is an interesting thing about it, but we'll come down to that. What aspects of Mark Twain's life can you see reflected in the novel? I've heard it said that even with fiction, every book is autobiographical. So you're going to see the writer's life reflected in whatever he writes. I was getting ready to say, what problems do readers and critics have with the novel? And many people think it's the great American novel, but it's not perfect. It has several, we're going to point out 3 flaws that the book has. If you are the best, people are going to criticize it, because they don't agree, and they're going to find you're at the top. They got to shoot you down. So it's not surprising that people, particularly a book in our culture today, that's although not, it's really not about race. That is not. It's about slavery, and it is. So that makes it about race, of course. But it's just an interesting way the book handles it. So how could we still be reading that book? And I taught it for years at Page, and African American students read it. We never read it out loud, so we weren't saying the N word. That would have been dangerous and unnecessary. I never had an African American student, complain about it. They never said anything to me. This is I can't read this. Got the N word in it. They never said that. And I remember reading hearing about Burlington City or whatever town. Was that Randolph? Is that Randolph County? No. What is Burlington? Alamance County. But I remember Burlington City Schools had this policy. They read it like 2 or 3 times. I thought that was kind of crazy with all the great books available. Why would you want to read it more than once? But anyway, It's not perfect. What are the major themes? That's true with any book. How does the novel reflect the viewpoint of realism? So we've been looking at romanticism, except for the modern books like The Crucible and All the King's Men. Even Hawthorne was a romantic era book. So we need to figure out what is realism. Mark Twain was a proponent of it. And finally, how does Twain's choice of Huck as a narrator affect the novel? Anybody of you read Tom Sawyer? You know, it's got all the characters, many of the characters in that book, but it's narrated by a third-person narrator. And a lot of people say the success of Huck Finn is because he chose Huck as the narrator. So we'll get into that. Do you know much about Mark Twain himself? What do you know, Lily?
He was like a riverboat.
Yes.
And he like puts a lot of that in his book, I feel like.
Yes. Yeah, very good. Did you know his name, his real name? Samuel Langhorne Clemens. Born in Florida, Missouri. Didn't live there very long. They moved to Hannibal. Hannibal is the St. Petersburg of Tom Sawyer and of Huck Finn. Now, most of the book does not take place there. It takes place on the river, but it starts at the same spot. In fact, it starts where Tom Sawyer left off. Even alludes to that at the beginning of his first chapter. He even summarizes the end of Tom Sawyer, that is Huck does, and he's living now under different conditions. And you get to meet the widow Douglas and Miss Watson and Jim. I don't remember Jim and Tom Sawyer. In fact, it's been years. I've only read Tom Sawyer a couple of times in my life. I had a teacher read it to us, which endeared me to it because those were always pleasant experiences whenever that happened.
Wait, so Florida was the name of the town?
Yeah. There's a California, Pennsylvania, I believe. Some strange things like that. He was a riverboat pilot. Now, any of you nautical people? I know pilots fly airplanes, but you think of in terms of ships, the pilot is the guy that guides the ship. As I understand it, when it gets to the harbor, the pilot takes over and gets it berthed, gets it docked. I think that's right. So you have a skipper, you have a captain, but he kind of relinquishes as soon as he gets to the port. A riverboat pilot, as I understand it, was the guy who actually sailed the ship up the Mississippi. Yeah. Life on the Mississippi, I recommend that. I got it actually when I was in middle school. My parents gave me the book, and at the time I thought, I don't want a book for Christmas. And I later used that very book in a graduate class, when I had to read it, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Isn't it amazing how we mature and how our interests grow? But anyway, I recommend Life on the Mississippi. It's actually nonfiction. Well, with Mark Twain, it's hard to decide, because even the nonfiction, he stretches. You know, he's a humorist. Some people might call him a liar, but you would never call Mark Twain rather a liar. But it is, I recommend it. He serves that's what makes me laugh. Serves 2 weeks in a Confederate volunteer unit. Now I heard somebody say the Missouri Compromise, right? And I hear somebody say that in that map that you got there, in that pre-Civil War. So he's in Missouri. What's going on in Missouri? I don't know what time period you're looking at, but this is probably 1850s. Are you that far? Wasn't there a compromise of 1850? Was that the Missouri Compromise, or is that
I think Missouri Compromise was earlier.
1820? That's the Missouri Compromise. So there's a compromise of 18. Are you there? Yes. Oh, you're past that. So what happened at the compromise of 1850? This is not fair, Mr. Powell. This is not history class. What are you doing, asking?
Well, we don't have an exam for a reason.
Well, tell me, do you remember anything about that? I think I even remember something about, was that the one where they decided these states will be slaves, these states will be free? What is,
They didn't
what was
want
it?
right.
Yeah, they wanted the balance
They
to
wanted-
be even.
So what was Missouri?
Missouri was a slave state.
And what was Illinois? Oh, that wasn't involved, right?
No, it was
Maine.
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 It was Maine.
They said if you admit Missouri as a slave, you have to admit Maine as a free state.
Okay, so that's what they did, right? Well, the reason I mentioned Illinois is because in the book, Tom, or Jim and Huck live in, Missouri, and, Jim escapes, you know this, you've heard it, he runs away. And the question always was, why did he sail down the river? Why didn't he just cross the river into Illinois? And, it makes pretty clear in the book that Illinois was a free state. Well, that would be good, right? A slave going to a free state, but was the 1850 compromise, the fugitive slave law, was that a part of it?
Probably.
It was already.
Well, I think they had it, but never enforced it, earlier, but they were gonna enforce it. So if he goes to a free state, he's not free. And so that's part of the things Huck, Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn had to work out, and Mark Twain. He had to, he's trying to create a story that'll last. And so if they get to freedom, then the story's over. So one of the dilemmas was, he's gotta keep him on the river. But what, if you go past Ohio, the Ohio River, which comes into the Mississippi, what becomes the irony of his escape from slavery? The further south he goes, what's the problem? He's a slave trying to escape slavery. Where did most of the slaves in the South want to go?
North.
And how north?
Very north.
As far as they could.
Which was what?
New York.
Beyond New York.
Canada?
Yeah, a lot of them would go to Canada. But where's Jim and Huck headed?
Farther south.
They're headed further south. So it's one of the interesting ironies of the book. To avoid slavery, he ends up heading south, getting deeper and deeper in the completely opposite direction that a slave would want to go. But the reason I laugh at this, because can you imagine what we know of Mark Twain? He could kill anybody. Now, there were some interesting sides of his personality. He was had such an interesting view of life and humorous. He spends 2 weeks with his brother. It's a volunteer unit, so he would not be going AWOL, because it's not a regular outfit. So they go, and he writes a book about it. I can't remember the name of it, but there's one of the books about his travels west. Do you know anything about what Mark Twain, so I put it in quotation marks. It's not really a name at all. Do you know anything about the history of that? I had a student tell it to me, so she knew. Where that name comes from. Because his name is Samuel Langhorne Clemens. Yeah,
It's something, isn't it something to do with the boat again?
yes.
Gosh, I can't remember what it is. It's like a term.
Well, we know what Twain means, because you wrote a paper about it. What is Twain?
Emergence of the Twain.
Yeah, two things, Twain. It's a fancy word to say two. So I don't know what the two means, but if you were on a riverboat and you could hear all down the river, because they were going up and down, you would hear the guys on the boat at some point say Mark Twain. I don't know what Twain meant. Is it 2 fathoms? Is it 12 feet? Is it 2 feet? Whatever, but it was, I understand it to mean clear sailing. In other words, you got it, we can go now, because the river would get high and low. That's why this riverboat pilot earned his money, because not only did it go like this, the river, it had roots and all sorts of things, trees in it, but the river itself got higher and lower, and, supposedly in the middle would be the safest spot, but sometimes you had to go near the edge to avoid things. So, the way Mark Twain described it, it was you had to know the river like for thousands of miles. You had to know every bend in it. And so if you heard Mark Twain, they're trying to figure out how deep it is. So he's not the first to use it. It's interesting. There was a writer in newspapers at the time of his writing these books. Anyway, there was an author who called himself Mark Twain. He was a riverboat guy, and he wrote these little articles for newspapers. So the Mark Twain that we know stole it, and we don't know that other guy. but we know this guy, nobody stole it after that. It would have been too, nobody really knew this guy. So that's how we get to that. I think his name is interesting. I like the idea of clear sailing, because at least early in his life, that was the kind of person he was, kind of hopeful, yeah.
Whenever the novel came out, was he immediately famous, or did it take a while?
Very good. Let me go to the next slide, because I think that might help answer. The book that made him famous is not a book. So it's 1865, the war's over, but it's a short story that we have. Maybe we should read it. I think that'd be great. I don't know why I've never taught it here, but The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County is what made him famous. And that's 1865. So 20 years later, 19 years later, is when he publishes Huck Finn. So he's already well known by the time Huck Finn comes out. One of the themes that he covers in all of his books is the con man. We had a company check out some of our issues in our house yesterday. We're going to charge us $800 to fix, the baskets in the sinks. The sink goes down a drain, but there's a piece that is part of the upper drain. It's in the sink. And I wasn't even there. I was here. My wife, she told me she fired me. Now, this was just an estimate. But they said, yeah, we'll do it for $800. My son said, I'll do it for $40, because that's how much the parts cost. You wonder, and I trust these people. I would never tell you who they were, because that would be bad advertising, a bad report, so to speak. But you wonder today, if there aren't con men. Do you know what a con man is? You ever seen one? You ever been accosted by one? Your parents ever? What is a con man?
Oh, it's a con man. It's Owen.
What's a con man? What's a con man?
Some guy who's out for the money instead of just.
And that's in Robin Hood.
Yeah.
And I've learned, now you think con means convict. I don't think so. I think it means confident. There used to be another word, a confidence man, confidence. Because what they do is they gain your confidence and then they steal you, blind, they trick you. So I think that's where the word con comes from, confidence man. Anyway, they're very numerous in the West during this time. They were always around. But several of the people in the story, Huck Finn, are confidence men or con men.
So this is Tom Sawyer,
Yeah, so I can't remember much about that.
about the painting the fence.
That's exactly right. So even Huck has a little con. That was, wasn't that Huck or was that Tom?
That was Tom.
That was Tom, but Tom and Huck have a little con man in them. But this is funny because it's the con man being con. The guy, the confidence man who thinks he can fool people, and he gets conned by somebody else. That's what made him famous. This is a funny book. I read this also in that course. And I thought it was funny. I mean, I laughed out loud. I don't know what makes you laugh. If you do not laugh while you read Huck Finn, I'm going to have to say you got to read it again at some point, because I think as you understand it and as you get a little older, maybe your humor tastes are refined a little bit, you will find Mark Twain very funny. What he does here, he travels to the Middle East, to Jerusalem and that area. Now we're talking about the 1860s. Of course, you sail everywhere you go. He goes to Europe, like in Rome. And can you imagine this, as you get to know Mark Twain, putting the American, practical American man in a place like that, a real cultured, historical place, and the comic opportunities there. I don't remember any of the details, but I just remember his description of some of these paintings and the great artwork in architecture in Rome, and then going to the Middle East and the Holy Land, they called it. I recommend that. I don't think it's that long. Of course, Tom Sawyer, 1876, and then Huck Finn, 1884. I'd like for you to remember that date. I just think putting it in perspective, we're talking about 30 years after Walden was written, which was, well, published, 1854, it's published. So 30 years later, you have, which Huck Finn is considered a greater book. You put those, they're two different kind of books. They're not both novels. Then he dies in Reading, Connecticut. That's kind of interesting because you don't associate him at all with Connecticut, but I think he spent most of his adult life there. He bought a house there that's, I think, a museum now. He called it Stormfield, and Stormfield was a character in one of his books. But that's where he lived and died in Connecticut. Mark Twain in Connecticut, that doesn't sound right. He's truly someone that has good things happen to him, as we'll look at here, and some bad things happen to him. So let's look at the good things. He wrote 25 books. That's a pretty good life's work, and not small books, a couple of them are. Here are some of the others that we've already mentioned a few. Prince and the Pauper. Again, I read that. I really enjoyed it. It's what you expect. He loved the things of switched identity, kind of like the Hallmark Channel and Candace Cameron Bure. She was in this great movie last night called Switched at Christmas. You got to see it. I'm just kidding. It's like Switched at Christmas 2. Like they didn't get it the first time, so they tried again, and it still worked. She and her identical sister, which is her, and she's the corporate executive, and one's the teacher, the art teacher. So they switch so that the art teacher can do the Christmas party that the executive doesn't want to do. That's a theme. That's not new. That's what the Prince and the Pauper. Prince was the crown prince, and the pauper was just a kid on the streets, and they kind of resembled each other, and they switched roles. So you now get to see royalty from a pauper's viewpoint, and you get to see poverty from a royal viewpoint. It's just a simple and very effective way to show what things are like. Same thing here. This is really interesting book. Connecticut Yankee. Have you read any of these books? Okay. Part of my job is to introduce them to you. But Connecticut Yankee is about a Yankee American in this time who gets hit on the head. He gets transported back to King Arthur. And it's just, okay, what would a practical American farmer, how would he manage in the times of King Arthur? And it's very satirical, making fun of and criticizing royalty, which he does in Huck Finn. He constantly cuts down or criticizes that aristocratic layer in our culture, wealth, and then the royalties of the world in Europe. You know, there were royals even at the beginning of World War I. There were still many of the countries in Europe still had kings. And I learned just the other night that Queen Elizabeth, her great-grandfather, was actually part German. And during World War I, that wouldn't work because the British were fighting the Germans, so he changed his name from this German name to Windsor, which is what their names are now. It's really just a made-up name in a way. They lived in Windsor Castle. They aren't Windsors, but they took the name Windsor. So Elizabeth is her father, and her and Charles and Harry, who's the oldest, William, they're Windsors. That's really not a name at all, but he loved making fun of royals. And what does the Yankee do? What does the American do? He just kind of makes fools of everybody because he points out their superstition and all the things they believe that were just nonsense. And so Mark Twain is able to comment on medieval life. Pudd'nhead Wilson, maybe the saddest book ever written. My wife thinks so because I showed her the excellent movie done in the 80s by, PBS ran it. And but it was Ron Howard, who plays Opie. His older brother plays the role of Pudd'nhead Wilson. I can't remember his name. Howard was his last name, but he had a TV show in the 80s. But he plays Pudd'nhead Wilson, and he's a lawyer in a small town during slavery, and they call him Pudd'nhead because he's not all there. He likes to do things like take people's fingerprints. It's the first novel ever written, detective novel, that uses fingerprints as a part of the story. So he likes to take people's fingerprints as a hobby. They think he's nuts. He doesn't have any cases, because they think he's nuts, but they love him, and he's a nice guy. The real story is in Pudd'nhead Wilson is the slave Roxy, who is working for the master as a house slave, taking care of the master's child, and here's a rumor that the master's in financial trouble and wants to sell some of the slaves down the river. And she's panicking. She looked at the two children, her child and the other child. She, there's this moment in the book where it just dawns on her, and she switches. So her child, the slave boy, grows up to be the master. Again, think of the irony. And the master grows up as a slave. There's a crime committed. Pudd'nhead discovers it because of fingerprinting. And he not only discovers who does the crime, but he, in this dramatic courtroom scene, looks up at Roxy up in the stand, in the gallery, and puts her on the stands. Why'd you do it? Nobody knows it. That for 20 years, the slave was the master, and the master was the slave. And the reason the book is so terrible, because what if those two roles are reversed? Which they have to be. They change them. All of a sudden, the slave becomes the master, who was raised as a slave, now becomes master again. The slave, who was raised as the master, now becomes slave again. And she has to watch her son. This is the part my wife said, can't watch it anymore. She has to watch her son. You have this group of slaves. At the end is this white guy who looks, and acts as he was raised as a slave, as a master. He's shackled, and he goes off with them. And they weren't going to. He's guilty of murder. He actually killed somebody. So they should have punished him. But he's too valuable to punish because he's a slave. So again, ironically, he gets a infinitely worse punishment. He won't last the trip down to Louisiana. He's raised, protected, and sheltered. But think of the other hand, and you actually see some of this in Huck Finn. You actually see what slavery does to masters. It's terrible. One of the scenes, Huck has a friend who's Huck and Buck. They're just like alter ego. And Buck has a slave, and they give Huck a slave. He's just hanging around with him. And Huck doesn't know what to do. He's used to doing things on his own. But Buck, man, he keeps his slave hopping. That's why Huck notices slavery begins to corrupt the master. So it's a more subtle kind of corruption, but that's what this book, it's a masterpiece. Because at the end you realize the slave who's now become the master again, he's not qualified. It's not possible for him. He goes around bowing to people, he's like saying and talking because he grew up as a slave, and he'll never get that out of him the way he was treated. And so if you ever want to write a book, that's a great sort of technique to use, is to switch. Hey, so I don't know if you'll never read any of those books I just mentioned. You'll never read them here at college. But I want you to know about them things so that you can make that decision on your own someday. Get a chance to take Huck Finn or Mark Twain course in college. You might be thinking of some of these books, and you say, I'd like to study that. But look at all this. These are not books. These are stories, newspaper stories, travel books. So he was a prolific writer. He wrote an autobiography that's incredibly long. He's a very prolific writer. Now, Pudd'nhead Wilson is not long. It's very short. I think we have time to look at a few more of these. Those are all the good things. One of the most well-known people in America. Do you know what he looks like? Do you have an image in your mind of what? Where'd you get that?
There was a movie called The Ridiculous Six, and in the movie, he like portrays them. It's pretty
So
accurate.
tell me what the image is that you have.
Kinda skinny, like white curly hair, I don't know, average tall height. Also, he's on that, I think. Is right there.
Trying to find
With the
it.
big
Oh, yeah,
big
that's,
mustache.
I'm gonna actually show you that picture again, so if you can't see it. The big mustache, the hair, the white suit, it's an image that he cultivated. So that's the successful, Mark Twain. Here's the tragic Mark Twain. He lost, his son and 2 daughters and a wife. So 4 people, everybody in his family died before he died. He has to bury his wife and 3 children. Second thing, he invested huge amounts of money into the development of a brand new printing press, state-of-the-art printing press. But before it could be patented, somebody else invented it also, got the patent, and so all that money was wasted. Because now it's already been patented, they couldn't make it, even though it's essentially the same as the other one. So he lost a lot of money in that. And finally, this is always sad to me, did you know that comedians and humorists are often very sad people? I don't know if you knew that, and of course, it makes sense if you think about it. If you've had sort of a tragic life, one way to cope with that is to laugh and to forget it all and become a humorist. Well, this was a little different. He actually had a good childhood. He didn't have any real tragedies in his childhood. He had a good life, but at the end of his life, things turned sour, and he writes things that are cynical, like just always looking at the dark side of life. Deterministic, which means we can't do anything about it. It's just bound to be que sera, sera. Whatever will be, will be. That's sort of the motto. Some of the stories are the Diary of Adam and Eve. They're kind of funny, but it's also dark. And so just know that if there are things about Mark Twain's writing at the end, it becomes a lot less funny. There's always a humor there. That's his angle. But you know what kind of dark humor is. It's funny, but it's based on something that's kind of sad. So these are the tragedies, if you want to put it that way. Just some things about the book before you start reading. It's satirical, and here are the things he satirizes. How would you describe satire? I mean, what is satire? Yeah.
It's almost like sarcasm at either politics or something that like is part of your everyday life, just kind of making fun of it.
Yeah, but you said sarcasm. What's the purpose of sarcasm? Kind of funny. I like Jack Burton's sarcasm, but what's the purpose of sarcasm? I mean, what's undertoning sarcasm?
Criticism?
What?
Criticism? Or like?
Right, sort of an anger. I mean, you may not be the person that overtly gets angry at people, but you know how to, yeah, that was really funny. I mean, you know how the sarcastic tone sounds. So satire does have that element. It's meant to improve society, but it does so by mocking it. And so he satirizes wealth and the aristocracy in America, mobs. Isn't that interesting? We don't have mobs. Well, we saw a bunch of mobs this summer. In the West, law in these days was hard to come by. And so rule, mob justice was very common. Lynchings were common. And so he satirizes that. Sentimentality is one of his favorite, and it's less dark, but people that are romantic and sentimental, he makes fun of. We'll see that often in the book. Hucksters, con men, I told you about that. 2 of the major characters, well, they're minor characters, but they're unforgettable characters, the King and the Duke. They are con men. And it's funny, and yet you think, well, these people are really hurting other people. They're stealing from them, and yet it's kind of funny the way they do it. The opposite of the huckster is the gullible person, the innocent person. you can't have a huckster or a con man unless you have a willing prey. And I'm afraid I've been guilty, I bet I've been conned before. You know, people trick you out of something, overcharge you, and, or, you know, just take advantage of you, but they get your confidence, then they do. You think that, you know, you think highly of them, and then you realize they just cheated you. It's written in this dialect. I'll be honest with you, when you get when Jim has these long speeches, they're not speeches, but he tells these stories, Jim, it's hard for me to read it. I don't wanna spend the time trying to figure out what these words mean. You can make that choice if you want. He doesn't do it too often. What's more workable is the dialogue between him and Huck. They go back and forth. But sometimes you get a long paragraph of some story that time. He's going to do it at the beginning. I would recommend you read that one because that reveals some things. It's hard to read sometimes. And finally, listen, the book, it took like 7 years to write the book. It starts it after the publication of Tom Sawyer. Wrote 18 chapters. The book has 43 chapters. Then he takes a 3-year gap, and he comes back to it. He writes 3 chapters. Then he takes another 3 or 4 year gap and finishes it. And it affects the novel. You could probably, I don't notice it here. I notice it between here and here. And tomorrow I'll just show you. Well, we can't do it tomorrow. I told her we're going to do the poetry, but we'll come back to that. I want you to read. I've asked you to read the first 12 chapters. It's just 60 pages. You have a week. You have questions. It covers most of the questions on both sides of that. If I choose to give you a quiz, I'm letting you know kind of where the material will come from. So again, first 12 chapters, it'll put you about page 66 in that book. And I think you will enjoy it. I hope you do. Tomorrow we'll do a little poetry. If we do, we can finish this. Maybe I'll finish this.